Hello, welcome to Module 4, Lesson 1 of our CASP Plus course. This lesson in Governance Risk Compliance will cover the following topics about risk strategies, covering risk assessments, risk handling techniques, risk types, risk management lifecycle, risk controls, risk tracking, and policies and security practices. All right, some sort of introduction. The effects of enterprise risk in businesses can be devastating, right? Both long-term and the short-term success require a thorough grasp of the risks involved. Security experts who are able to perform risk assessments are an asset to any company. Having a plan in place to deal with identified risks is essential for any company, whether those risks are driven by business imperatives or by the need to comply with regulations. Now, the management of risk is an ongoing process for any company. We can tell if our controls are working and if we're staying within the boundaries of the company's risk tolerance thresholds by keeping tabs on things and reporting on them. Management of business risk is facilitated by robust security measures. Secure day-to-day operations can be ensured with the help of well-established cybersecurity policies and practices. Now, lack of visibility into who handles or processes data increases the risk to an organization due to the supply chain's complexity. The responsibility of managing and evaluating vendors falls on the risk team. All right, let us talk about risk assessment. There are typically two approaches to risk assessment, one of which uses what we call as qualitative technique. The metrics employed in this strategy will be likelihood, the impact, and the possibly additional metrics like speed of onset. This is regarded as a fundamental kind of risk assessment and will incorporate the assessor's prior knowledge. A qualitative risk assessment is frequently thought of as a subjective method, which means that two different risk assessors may not always agree. Breaking the process down into steps or phases is a common risk management strategy. As you will see here, right, on this illustration, it shows the five-step process in risk management, which includes identify the business assets, identification of known vulnerabilities, identify the threats, what's going to be the business impact, and identification of the risk response. Now, we must be able to quantify a level of risk as a measurement in order to understand the risk. Since we always need to protect our assets, we must determine the level of risk by factoring in likelihood and the impact. So, utilizing a qualitative method is one of the approved methods for risk assessment. Now, next slide, we're going to examine this kind of assessment. Right. So here, we must take a step-by-step approach, right? Using likelihood versus the impact to perform a qualitative assessment. So as you will see here, the risk matrix can be quite straightforward, right? As shown here. So to prioritize the risk responses, it is critical to highlight the biggest risks. And when we evaluate risk in relation to particular assets, there are more detailed qualitative risk assessment systems. We can use the CIA or the Canadian Institute of Actuaries aggregate matrix when it is necessary to host various data types on a shared information system, which often is requiring different classification labels. Right? It's here. So on this one, right? It shows an illustration of the CIA's aggregate method of risk assessment. Now, using this method, we can ensure or we can make sure to identify the biggest systemic risks and use those as a starting point for applying controls. We can keep track of the peak value for each column when calculating the total values. The impact value for admin information is low in the previous screenshot, right? As you see here. So, however, we need to make sure that the appropriate controls are in place to minimize any potential effects on the OD alerts, right? And we might decide to put it in place with a high availability failover solution because this is a shared information system. Now, the fact that a qualitative method may be a simpler to execute is one of its advantages. However, it does not generate outputs that reflect the degree of financial risks. It might be necessary to use a quantitative approach, right, in order to present monetary values to decision makers in order to present the risk. Now, let's gonna examine the quantitative approach in terms of risk assessment. So we have a couple here that we're gonna cover, right? Like asset value, exposure factor, single loss expectancy, and so on and so forth until the mean time between failure. On the next few slides, we're gonna talk about each of them, right? So as you may know, it is very crucial to present these risks in a way that is simple to understand when communicating risk to company leadership. It is helpful to show decision makers the financial effects of risks when presenting them. So here, utilizing the quantitative risk assessment can help with these. Let's talk about the first one, which is the asset value. So knowing an asset's value is crucial when using a quantitative approach. So this could be the cost of purchasing the goods or perhaps the expenses incurred in building a customer marketing database. That's what we call as the asset value. Next is the exposure factor. So when evaluating risk, it is rare for there to be a complete 100% monetary loss in the event of an occurrence. It's likely that the costs to repair the damage if my building, is flooded will be higher than the building's total initial cost. And typically a percentage is used to represent this specific value. Next is a single loss expectancy or SLE. So this is so the asset value when multiply it with the exposure factor formula is used to determine the amount of loss during a single event. So you just have to multiply these two together for you to get this number. Next is the annualized loss expectancy or ALE. So if there are several incidents, we must determine how many events will take place in a calendar year. That's the ALE. The annualized rate of occurrence, ARO. So when you have SLE and you multiply it with ARO, it is being used to determine the total loss for the entire year. Right? The risk management team must evaluate all risks that could result in a loss for the company because it has a production facility. So next is a gap analysis. So a gap analysis is carried out to determine where potential missing controls may exist. We must be able to evaluate the current state of controls and contrast it with where we want the organization to be in order to perform this analysis. So as you see here, right, this diagram illustrates the procedures needed to carry out a gap analysis. So it starts with the identification of the current state, identify the desired state or the target state, what's going to be the solution to bridge the gap, and the last one is the deployment of the solution to bridge the gap. All right, so senior management can be informed of the findings to help with the response. Next is a TCO, or the total cost of ownership. So it's critical to take into account all costs, not just the one associated with the initial purchase, when evaluating solutions to manage or reduce risks. Numerous solutions could necessitate upkeep, software licensing, additional personnel, or other costs that could or that would need to be estimated over the course of the solution's lifetime. Next is ROI, or return on investment. An ROI is a crucial metric, right? Because it can be used to quantify the financial advantages of a suggested control. A strong return on investment for a suggested risk mitigation solution is a good way to convince senior management of your recommendations. Although it can also be presented as a percentage, it is typical to present an ROI as a pure monetary value. Next is MTTR, or mean time to recovery. So Researching the effectiveness of the proposed solution is crucial when security professionals are evaluating multiple solutions that have been put forth. When choosing a mitigation solution, MTTR might be an important metric to consider. The NAS could serve, or the network attached storage, right, could serve as an illustration of how to safeguard our data from ransomware attacks. It might take 2 hours to restore backed up data from a NAS to a server, compared to 4 hours for a restore from a tape-based media. So with this metric, a lower value is the desired result. This mean time to failure metric would be used for systems that could not be recovered. And the last metric is the MTBF, or the mean time between failure. MTBF, or mean time between failure, is a metric that can be used to determine a system's reliability. The ideal value is higher, right? And therefore, if my server is like infected with a crypto malware twice in a 24-hour period and requires data restoration from the NAS, the server will be offline for 4 hours, or 20 hours divided by 2 equals 10, right? The MTBF would therefore be 10 hours. Now, we can look at methods to control these risks once we have chosen appropriate metrics to assess the risk. All right, now let's talk about the next topic, which is risk handling techniques. All right, now let's talk about implementing risk handling techniques. So once risks have been identified, it is important to plan a course of action. There's actually various factors, right, such as the organization's risk appetite and regulatory requirements, which will influence how approaches are taken. The four primary risk response categories are depicted on this figure, right, which is transfer, accept, avoid, and mitigate. So an organization should think about the following risk response strategies. So let's talk about the first one, which is transfer. So transference may be a suitable strategy when an organization wants to control or mitigate risk but lacks the personnel or financial resources to do so. In the event of a fire, the company should think about purchasing fire insurance if it cannot afford to rebuild the warehouse. The company may think about hiring a third party to handle this payment if it lacks the staff or infrastructure to support secure card payments. Next is accept. So when the risk is accepted, it typically means that the organization has decided it is acceptable given its risk appetite and tolerance. A low probability event, such as an earthquake or flood, in a dry area with no prior record of earthquakes or flood, would serve as an illustration of risk acceptance. Next is avoid. So the organization should stop the activity that has been determined to be outside of the acceptable risk tolerance in order to avoid the risk. Risk avoidance will be justified if the risk is deemed to be extremely high, such as the possibility of losing one's life. And the fourth one is mitigate. Risk mitigation through controls is frequently the response to risk. These safeguards could be administrative, technical, or physical. While risk mitigation won't completely eliminate it, it should reduce it into a manageable level. An acceptable user use policy, or AUP, right? AUP for mobile devices could be implemented as a mitigation measure. Additionally, mobile device management, or MDM, would enable the organization to encrypt corporate data. Recognizing risks that will need to be absorbed in some way is important, in addition to developing efficient risk responses. Now let's talk about risk types. It is important to realize that risk cannot be completely eliminated unless we choose to avoid it when conducting risk assessment. And there will always be some types of risk, like inherent risk, residual risk, and risk exceptions. So what is an inherent risk? This is the risk that exists in the absence of any controls. A financial institution hiring staff without conducting background checks or formal interviews could serve as an example. However, the bank vault is not secured by any locks or barriers. And when deciding on a specific area of operation or industry, some organizations will have to accept a much higher level of inherent risk. Now, when considering conducting business in a hostile region, there's a risk that is inherently present on both an environmental and a political level. Now let's talk about residual risk. This risk still exists after controls have been implemented. There will always be some risk, but it will be decreased to a level that is acceptable to the corporation. Background checks for employees, biometric locks, and closed circuit television or CCTV for the vault may be solutions for banks. And a third one is risk exception. An exception is when a corporation is unable to follow corporate policy or regulatory requirement. A risk exemption may be necessary due to circumstances that are out of the organization's control or a technical limitation. Legacy applications or equipment may be a common requirement for a risk exemption. Exemptions ought to be formally stated in writing and approved by the relevant stakeholders or business owners. Frameworks, controls, and efficient management are important, right? For an enterprise because risk management is a continuous process. Now let's talk about the risk management lifecycle. So the process of risk management is cyclical, and risk must be continuously identified. Security professionals may face new demands as a result of changing business practices and regulatory compliance. Due to these evolving practices, the organizations will need to regularly evaluate its security posture to ensure that the controls and best practices are implemented. The stages of the risk assessment life cycle are depicted in this specific figure, which starts with identify, right? So among the many factors that could, this refers to the many factors that could contribute to enterprise risks are the business process, personal technology, and intellectual property or IP. Next is assess, right? So during this phase, we must pinpoint potential threats, weaknesses, and the degree of risk they pose to the business. And the third is control. So in this phase, we identify the controls that will satisfy the needs of the enterprise in terms of the levels that they are willing to accept. Then we have review. At this stage, it is important to recognize that the industry, the law, and the threat environment will all change. The business must evaluate these new risks when things change. Like, are the controls still sufficient in light of the evolving threat environment? Right? There are also many frameworks used by organizations, and a particular model typically receives wide acceptance depending on the industry or operational needs. Now let's examine a few risk management frameworks. The first one is the NIST CSF, right, or the Cybersecurity Framework. So here, this was developed to offer organizations advice on how to stop, recognize, and react to cyber attacks. It serves as a general guideline for cybersecurity for various business sectors. So the figure depicts a typical life cycle divided into five different stages. The first one is identify. So here, the organization needs to identify all assets that could be at risk from cybersecurity at this stage, like people, systems, data, and business operational capabilities. In other words, any element of risk can all be considered as assets. Now, we cannot effectively concentrate efforts on the important aspects of the business without this identification stage. Next is protect, right? So the next step is to protect once we have determined all of the critical assets and will reduce and mitigate any harm that could result from a cybersecurity incident. Third is detect. So here, the ability of the organization to recognize when a cybersecurity incident is occurring is also important. We will need a combination of security experts, properly trained personnel, and automated detection to be successful during this phase. Next is respond. In order to respond to cybersecurity incidents, it is important to have appropriate plans in place. We must be able to stop cybersecurity incidents and keep running our business. It is important to concentrate on communication, response planning, and tools and methods for analysis, mitigation, and ongoing improvement. And the last one is recover. So here, an enterprise should maintain plans during the recovery phase that allows the organization to recover from major events such as business continuity planning or incident response plans. At this point, it's critical to concentrate on resilience. All right, now let's talk about risk controls. Okay, so when all the potential risks that an enterprise needs to manage are taken into account, there are numerous challenges involved here, like with employees, business processes, and technology all intertwined. It's quite a delicate balancing act. The relationship between people, procedures, and technology is depicted in this specific figure. And to make sure that they will work well together, it is important to take into account all of these factors. So first, let's talk about people, right? People. So the controls we select must be reliable and well liked by our team. They might try to get around the obstacle if they are overly complicated or poorly executed. Users may find ways to get around strict password policies by reusing passwords or writing down complex passwords. Right? Next are processes. So within the enterprise, it is important to formalize the processes that will be used. A business process should guarantee that objectives are accomplished in a secure and safe manner. The organization's standards and policies will aid in ensuring that processes are carried out securely but effectively. Processes with the potential for fraudulent activity should be changed, and any SPOFs or single points of failure should be located and eliminated. And the third one is technology. So, when thinking about risk controls, technology can be helpful. There are many ways that innovation can be significant or can be a significant business driver. Automation can assist in resolving or accelerating complex processing issues. Machine learning and AI, or artificial intelligence, are assisting in defending our information systems against increasingly sophisticated threats. However, we must use this technology to ensure that it makes the right choices because many systems still involve humans in the decision-making process. We must keep an eye on risk activities to determine whether the controls are working as intended. Okay, now on the next section, we're going to look at the methods used for risk tracking or risk monitoring. So it is critical that the appropriate organizational stakeholders understand and manage the enterprise risk. Every risk, the steps taken to mitigate it, and the business owner who was affected by the risk should be recorded. A risk register should be used to record this, right? So as you will see here, this is a typical risk register template, right? Here you will see the date, when it's raised, what's the description, what's going to be the likelihood, is it low, medium, high, impact if the risk occurs, what's the severity, who will be the owner, right? This is very important, right? We have to ensure that there's always an owner on a specific task or a specific entry in the risk register. Otherwise, it cannot be closed. And the last column is the mitigating action to be able to to resolve that risk. So here, we need to ensure we have a reliable way to monitor risk if we want to make sure that the organization can adhere to regulatory requirements. By keeping an eye on risk, we can see reports on potential threats and identify any areas where the company may be overexposed. We require efficient metrics that enable an enterprise to track performance with regard to risk in order to monitor and address risks. All right, now let's talk about KPIs, right, or key performance indicator. A KPI is a quantifiable value that enables a business to pinpoint crucial internal processes that support a strong security posture. KPIs can be used to track the performance of various tasks, such as the proportion of endpoints that have received security updates to date and quantity of unresolved security incidents, the mean time to repair after a security event, or the proportion of employees who have finished security awareness training. Next important topic is key risk indicators, or KRI. So KPIs and KRIs have a direct relationship. They're created in tandem in order to pinpoint the procedures that support strategic goals. We need a way to measure the performance of the key business processes we can pinpoint as a potential risk contributor, where we can set thresholds to indicate where an activity poses a risk to the enterprise. KRI should provide early warnings with proper reporting to ensure that the risk does not balloon and go beyond our risk tolerance. Now, when the risk to the business is quantified by a KPI that the company has identified, there must be an agreement. Like if patching workstation is important, a KPI showing that less than 90% of them are patched could indicate a serious risk to the company's operations. One of the biggest cybersecurity risks is ransomware, right? Which preys on unpatched, vulnerable systems. Next is risk appetite. Risk appetite is the measure of how much risk a company is willing to take in order to achieve its goals. This will vary between the various business sectors and industries and be strongly influenced by the company's culture, rivals, goals, and financial health. It is challenging to pin down a precise number when discussing risk appetite. The three levels of risk appetite are typically low, medium, and high. So in many industries, there's typically a sweet spot where things are acceptable. A large customer base may allow an energy provider to be content with running gas-fired power plants. It is well-established technology, and if it is mature and the general secure, there's no reason to alter the business model or focus on different clientele. They just don't take a lot of risk. Next is risk tolerance. So this is the departure from the risk appetite that a company will tolerate. The metric can be written as a numerical value or a percentage. The energy provider bargains with international suppliers for upcoming gas deliveries. Since the company has set this as its risk tolerance, we must act if gas reserves for unexpectedly cold weather fall to less than 5%. And the last concept is trade-off analysis. There may be numerous risk and response strategies to consider when evaluating enterprise risk for a large organization. Now, according to stakeholder priorities, there might be conflicting opinions, and it might be necessary to take the enterprise's strategic goals into account. An organization may decide to divert personnel from the sales team in order to devote more resources to customer-facing support teams if it determines that customer satisfaction is its top priority. In the short term, this might result in fewer sales, but the long-term plan might result in more clients. All right, let's talk about the policies and the security practices. There's numerous strategies that can be used to reduce risk. One efficient way to achieve organizational goals is through policies. Although they do not ensure that all security objectives are met, they are a crucial layer when we use the DID, or the defense in depth concept. Now, by putting in more layers of security, we have backup controls in case one control fails. One of the best practice is the separation of duties, or SOD. So here, we lack the necessary checks and balances when an employee has access to high-level decisions without the need for the approval of another employee. Think about a CFO, or Chief Financial Officer, who approves new suppliers, approves service provider invoices, and signs paychecks. In this case, setting up accounts receivable and accounts payable business function would help to prevent fraudulent activities. Next is job rotation. Employees who work in the same position for an extended period of time are more likely to burn out and become complacent. A shift in job responsibilities indicates that the company has redundant skill sets and motivated employees. Another advantage is that fraud will be less likely to occur because employees will be able to set up long-term hidden practices and because a new employee may spot fraud. Next is mandatory vacation. It's standard practice in some industries for employees to take an annual leave of absence from work. Although the length may vary, in finance, a 2-week mandatory vacation is advised. Their position can be audited while they are on vacation, and thanks to this time off. Mandatory vacation also acts as a deterrent, which is another advantage. If the employee is not present to address potential issues, it might be challenging to conceal an unauthorized activity from the company. Next is a list of privilege. This is actually a good practice that entails identifying business functions and having strong account management rules to guarantee the user has the privileges they require for their position. Although it might seem obvious, it is simple to forget about this fundamental control. It is standard procedure to add a worker to a role group with privileges far in excess of what they actually require. Now consider the administrator group on a Windows server, which gives the user access to all administrative tasks on the machine. If a technician is added to the administrator group, they will receive additional privileges that go beyond what they need to install software and hardware drivers. Next is employment and termination procedures. So, without the adoption of policies for new hires and employees who leave the organization, many risks could be disregarded. Background checks and employee vetting should be done for new hires. Now, when onboarding new employees, required security training, equipment assignment, the execution of an AUP, and where necessary, non-disclosure agreements are all required. Employees should be offboarded when they leave the company. Exit interviews are a part of offboarding and will help the company understand potential employee reasons for leaving and improve future employee retention. Whistleblowers may be encouraged to come forward by exit interviews. An employee may be quitting due to the unprofessional behavior and attitudes of their coworkers. It is important to recover all company assets during offboarding and to disable user account credentials. Next is training and awareness of users. Since users are an organization's most valuable resource, security awareness training is an essential procedure. Since insider threats account for over 50% of data breaches, users can also be seen as the weakest link. Now, one of the most important things to take into account when dealing with data breaches is poorly trained users. All employees should receive basic security training, along with more specialized instructions specific to their job duties. Alright, and the last one is auditing requirements and frequency. So, the enterprise must conduct routine audits to ensure it complies with legal requirements and reduces the risk of fraudulent or nefarious behavior. The Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA, mandates annual audits of government contractors and suppliers.